Hi everyone, my name is Debbie and I want to welcome you to California State Parks Ports Home Learning Program. PORTS stands for Parks Online Resource for Teachers and Students. I'm a guide here at the California State Railroad Museum, and we're located in Old Sacramento State Historic Park in Sacramento, California. We acknowledge the land as the traditional home of the Nisenan and Miwok people. These sovereign people have been caretakers of this area since time immemorial. We remember their continued connection to the region and offer our respect to the elders and to all Miwok and Nisenan people of the past and present. Well, today we're here to celebrate Women's History Month, and we have two very special women as our guests today who are going to talk to us about their experience as an engineer and a conductor on our very own excursion or tourist railroad here called the Sacramento Southern Railroad, or Sac Southern, as we like to call it around here. Sac Southern operates a train ride, a scenic train ride along the Sacramento River. It's about a 50-minute round trip ride, and it operates every Saturday and Sunday throughout the spring and summer here in Old Sacramento. So if you're ever in the area, be sure and check it out. It's a great, fun activity for the whole family. Now, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about the history of railroading and women. In the early days of the railroad, in the 19th century and the early to mid 20th centuries, most of the railroad jobs were held by men, but women did hold a few jobs. So to get us started today, I'm going to start with a poll question and see what you think out there. What types of jobs would women have held in the early days of the railroad? Do you think that they would have been a conductor or an engineer, a brakeman, or a telegrapher? And we're going to give you a few minutes to record your answers there. Got enough time there? Okay. Well, if you answered telegrapher, you would be correct. Telegraphy was one of those we call gender neutral positions in the railroad, meaning that both men and women would have held those positions. Other than that, women held positions like possibly cleaning railroad stations or serving food at station stops along the way. Before the Civil War, enslaved Black women worked alongside enslaved Black men, doing the hard physical labor of laying the railroad tracks. During World Wars I and II, women filled in for the men who went overseas to fight in those wars, and they filled every possible position in the railroad. However, when the men returned from war, the women did have to give up those jobs for the returning soldiers. Today, women work in all aspects of railroad, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But before we go on, I do want to bring up one more thing. Here in the museum, we have a new exhibit called Crossing Lines, Women of the American Railroad. And if you come in here, you'll find out about some very special women and their contributions to the railroad and also to society as a whole. If you can't make it to the museum, we've taken care of that too. There's a digital version of the exhibit, and if you just go online to californiarailroad.museum, you'll be able to check out that exhibit. So, with that, I'm going to turn our program over to my friend and coworker, Amanda. Amanda's going to introduce our special guest to you, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that Sac Southern Railroad. So take it away, Amanda.
Yeah. All right. Hello, everybody. So as you just heard, My name is Amanda, and I want to give you all a little bit of information about our two very special guests we have here today. So on your left, right there, is Cheryl Meyer, who is the first and only female engineer at Sac Southern Railroad. She joined the Sac Southern Railroad as a car attendant in 1986, and over the years, she worked through the ranks and was eventually promoted to an engineer in the fall of 1997. In addition to being a certified locomotive engineer, she is also qualified as an engineer of steam locomotives. Her husband is also a volunteer with Sac Southern and is currently in the process of recertification. She retired from her work in the nonprofit world in 2017, and her other interests include camping and water sports. On your right is Michelle White, who grew up right here in Sacramento and worked for 35 years for the California Department of Health Services and ensured that underserved communities in California had access to quality medical care. When she retired, she became a docent and tour guide at the Leland Stanford Mansion State Historic Park, which is right around the corner from us at the Railroad Museum. And she became interested in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and Sacramento history. She saw a small advertisement in the newspaper about the California State Railroad Museum and decided to sign up for the new docent class in October of 2009, 13 years ago. She was a docent here at the museum for a couple of years, and then she became a car attendant with Sac Southern. In 2014, Michelle passed the required training for brakeman with Sac Southern, and in 2016, she became a certified conductor. Now, I also want to give you all a little bit of history about Sac Southern, why we have that volunteer program. So the history of Sac Southern goes all the way back to 1855 when the Sacramento Valley Railroad ran between Sacramento and Folsom. Through a series of corporate buyouts and restructurings, it eventually came under the control of the Central Pacific and then the Southern Pacific, and eventually incorporated into the Sac Southern Railroad. And so between the early 1900s and the 1970s, it operated mostly for agricultural reasons, carrying things like celery, asparagus, pears, seeds, and other products, until 1972, when a levee break made a lot of those rails unusable. In 1981, the California State Railroad Museum opened, and then in 1984, the first ever volunteer-operated excursion train ran from Old Sacramento to Miller Park. And since 1984, over 2 million guests have taken a ride aboard the Sac Southern Railroad. And as of today, those weekend excursion trains are run by all volunteer teams who are qualified and fully trained and certified. And every year, the Sac Southern Railroad attracts around 80,000 riders. It's a very successful program. So now that we have all that background, we can go ahead and start with our very first question for you both. So what would you say is the proper terminology for operating a locomotive? So do you drive it? Do you engineer it? What's the correct terminology?
I would have to say that you operate it, because you can't drive it like driving a car. It doesn't have a steering wheel. Mm-hmm. All I do is operate a little lever that goes forward and backwards, and then control the speed, and hopefully I can stop the train when I need to. Hopefully. Usually.
It is quite heavy. So
yes.
It is. A lot of momentum.
Yes.
A lot of momentum.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, we'd like to know just how do you actually achieve the position that you have with the railroad? For example, what kind of experience did you need? How long did it take you? We've covered a little bit of that in your bios, but for both of you, if you could go into that detail. So, Cheryl, would you like to go first?
Sure. I came to this without a real interest in railroads. My husband was the one that was really very interested in railroads. And I thought, well, I might as well become a docent down here as well, because I'll never see my husband. And then I joined the railroad when the same year that he joined the railroad. And I was a little afraid of the stuff because it's heavy and massive. And there were some folks that would say, hey, this stuff will kill you. But the more I was around the equipment, I realized it will only kill you if you're kind of not paying attention. So I thought, I'm going to give my hand at this, give it a try. And I became a brakeman. I've never been a conductor. I just went into the engine service route after being a brakeman. So Michelle will be able to offer a little different perspective than I.
So I started as a docent in the museum and found it fascinating. I had no background, no family members. I worked on the railroad, and so I just came into it and started learning about it. It was really interesting, Sacramento history. And then I decided to start working on the Sacramento Southern because it's outside, you're talking to people all the time. You're meeting people from all over the world that are coming to visit the museum and see the railroad cars. And they're all vintage cars and vintage locomotives. So people are always asking questions and always taking pictures. I was a car attendant, and then I became a ticket agent. And then I decided to do something different. I was a first class steward for a while. But I saw the brakemen out there in their yellow construction vests, and they're waving their hands around and these hand signals. And I said, that looks like fun. I think I want to do that. I didn't realize at the time that it was a lot of hard work, but you just have to persevere, and you just have to keep practicing your skills over and over again. And I became pretty good at it, and used to work on the crews that actually brought the exhibits into the museum. So we would take the cars out of the museum and bring in different exhibits, and that was always exciting. And then I qualified as a conductor. So now it's a conductor is more of a management position because we're in charge of the train, making sure the train leaves the station on time, making sure it comes back on time, and filling out all the necessary paperwork that goes along with that.
Can you explain a little bit more about what a brakeman is? You both mentioned that, but we might not know. I don't really know what a brakeman does. Or in this case, a brake person.
There you go, gender neutral. Yes. A brake person is generally the person on the ground, the person on that will in a switching situation, that would be giving the engineer signals on which way to go and what to do. Because as I've been told, a good engineer only does what they're told when they're told. So that's usually I'm being told by the brakeman or the conductor. So that the brake person would be the person on the ground giving signals. They'd be responsible for throwing switches, which would direct the train one way onto one track or another, or stay on the existing track. If there's any kind of emergency, they'd have to walk the train and see what's going on. It's a very physical job. You're active all the time. Great. You add anything to that?
No, I think that's it. You're the eyes and ears of the engineer on the ground, because you're closer to the ground. The engineer can't always see. They're usually just looking straight out of the cab of the locomotive. They can't always see things directly in front of them. So you might have to stand over to one side or the other of the locomotive so that you can actually see, have eye contact with the engineer to give the signals and to throw the switches so they know what you're doing. The brakeman also does an air brake test on the train to make sure that the brakes are working and are functioning correctly. And if there's any problems with the anything mechanical on the train, then the brakeman is the person who goes and tries to fix that mechanical issue, unless it's actually the locomotive, and then that would be the engineer.
Thank you both very much. So is it hard to be a conductor or engineer?
If things are working perfectly, no. We do have situations where it could be very physical. You could have an air brake, something break in the air line where you have to physically go between the cars, fix the repairs. We had a situation the other day where one of the gaskets that seals the hoses together, the brakeman couldn't get that gasket out, and we actually needed a special tool to do that. We've had other situations where the conductor is a more senior position than some of the newer brakemen, so might have to provide some guidance to them on how to perform their functions. But other than that, I think it's usually pretty easy.
I'd have to agree with Michelle from an engineer's perspective. As long as things are running smoothly, it's easy. Because like I said, I can only go forward or backwards, go or stop or slow down. So I don't have a lot of options. But when things start to go south, maybe the train's down and I did not set the brakes. Got to figure out, my knowledge of where the air is, where it's coming from, where it's going to kind of like trace down how this could be happening. Let's see. You probably have to. I think one of my biggest challenges in the beginning was knowing when to apply the brakes to stop at a certain spot. Because sometimes I would blow through what I was trying to stop before, and sometimes I would stop yards away from it. So I think that's a little challenging for me. But hopefully, I've done it long enough that I can usually stop where I need to, or very close to. Very close to.
I think you do. We haven't heard any complaints.
Yeah.
But generally it's pretty easy. Because like I said, I don't have a lot of options. I just need to know how all those options work together.
I think it's like studying math or studying any subjects in school. The more you practice, the better you get at it. So the more we can come out and practice our skills, the easier it is for us. When we have a long break between times that we're out here, then we're a little rusty when we come back and we have to practice a little more.
That's so interesting. Well, you've talked a lot about parts of what you do, but can you give us an idea of what an average run would involve?
Well, I think an average day, we're going to kind of tag team this because we start out together in the morning at a morning briefing where I would contact the dispatcher, see if there's any changes to any conditions on the track, give a briefing to the crew, tell them about any restrictions that we might have to follow, any slowdowns, any unusual activities during the day that might affect our train. Maybe there's a fun run today that's going across Capitol Mall that might impact what we're doing. I would talk about that at the briefing. If there's any weather conditions that might affect anybody, we'd talk about that at the briefing. And then Cheryl would go and do her engine check. And we'll talk about what you do with the locomotive before we start.
Sure. After our meeting, I would go retrieve the locomotive from wherever it is. Usually it's in the Central Pacific Passenger Station. So I do an inspection. And then I would start the locomotive. Before I'd move the locomotive, I'd have to do an air test on the locomotive just to make sure that the valves are all functioning the way they should. And then once that is complete, I start my movement out of the passenger station or wherever the locomotive is located. And then we do what's called a light locomotive air test. That's just to make sure that the train will stop. Because before I just make sure that the air is moving. When I move the various handles in the locomotive, this is just the movement portion of it is actually ensuring that the train will stop when the brakes are applied. And then from there, we take the locomotive over to the train, couple it up to the train, and begin our initial terminal air test to make sure the whole train is capable of being stopped. But the whole train has operative brakes on it. And that's something that usually the conductor is in charge of, because he or she will tell me what to do.
And while the preparations are being done on the locomotive to bring it out to couple up to the train, I'm usually on the ground inspecting the train to make sure that there are no problems with the cars before they're coupled up to the engine. I unlock the cars, I inspect the inside of the consist to make sure that there's no damage, make sure everything's working properly, make sure we can find all of the safety equipment that we need, first aid kits, fire extinguishers, the automatic external defibrillator, and making sure all of the doors are unlocked in case we need to exit in an emergency. So once that's done, the initial terminal air brake test is usually being conducted, and I might have a briefing with our onboard crew to tell them about what's going to be happening during the day.
Then a few minutes before we're ready to depart, everybody takes a deep breath and gets ready to go. We will depart upon the signal from the conductor, and that's usually a highball.
Yeah, and I usually have to wait for the station master to tell me that all of the passengers are accounted for, that we aren't leaving anybody behind. And then once I get the signal to leave, I give a highball to the engineer. And then if there are any restrictions, like we have a place next to Embassy Suites where we have to go slow, I will tell the engineer, remind the engineer, we have to go slow at that portion. And then along the route, if there's anything I have to communicate to the engineer, I'll be doing that. Also counting the passengers to see how many passengers we have during the day.
So there's a radio in the cab of the locomotive, and Michelle also has a radio, and a few other crew members have radios as well. So that's how Michelle would remind me of the speed restrictions or any other restrictions in our operation for that day. But once we start moving, I do what's called a running air test. And that's just applying the brakes very lightly, just to ensure that the whole train will stop. Because it's better to do it when you don't need to stop than to do it when you need to stop and nothing happens. So we do a run with the operation here in Old Sacramento. We'll cross Capitol Mall, which is a fairly major street. And then we go down to a point we call Baths, which is about 3 miles down the line. And depending on what Michelle has planned, or the conductor of the day has planned, we may just stop there and do a run around, and back down to Sutterville Road, or we could go facing down to Sutterville Road and backwards to Baths, where we would do a runaround. And a runaround is basically where the engine disconnects from the train and goes over to a siding and runs around it to get on the other end of the train.
And that's where you would see the brakemen on the ground. They're the ones throwing the switches, changing the line so that the engine can go on the siding, and then coupling up the locomotive to the train and doing the air brake test. And then once that's completed, I give a highball to the engineer, and we go back to Old Sacramento.
And everybody has a good time when they get off the train. Or hopefully they had a good time on the train. Yes. And then they get off in Old Sacramento.
Wonderful. So I noticed that a lot of your day is put towards safety checks, making sure everything's safe, everything's up to code and everything. Have either of you ever been in a situation where things ended up getting a little dangerous, or were at risk of getting a little bit dangerous?
There have been circumstances where we do use vintage equipment. We have vintage locomotives, and sometimes the equipment does break down. That could be a little dangerous for us, because we have to then diagnose what the problem is and how to fix it, and either continue our run for the day or come back to Old Sacramento. Or we always have a locomotive here in Sacramento that's ready to go rescue us if it need be. So we've had to do that before. We've had a couple of situations where the very old trees along the track at Miller Park decided to fall down on the track, and we had to stop. If we couldn't remove the limbs from the track, we have to come back. We did have a couple of situations where handbrakes were not properly released, and we had to stop and correct those situations. But we tried to take every safety measure possible so that nobody gets injured in any of the situations that we're in.
We have the railroad, the staff of the railroad, the volunteers are pretty safety minded around this equipment. However, running in an area that's as crowded as Old Sacramento, a lot of the folks wandering around Old Sacramento don't pay attention that much to the equipment, even though, I mean, how can you miss something this big? They'd be walking on the tracks, or they'd stop as they're crossing the tracks. right in front of you. So we always have to be on the lookout for other people too, other people not paying attention to us.
Well, that's a good warning to everyone to
Yes.
be respectful of trains on the track. How fast do the trains go?
Our maximum speed is 20 miles an hour. And you may not think that's fast, but when you've got thousands of tons behind you, it's going to take a while to stop. And if you need to stop in an emergency, it's going to be challenging. I mean, you can stop, but in an emergency, but you may not stop as quickly as you'd like to.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you are wearing and how that applies with the jobs that you have?
Sure.
First?
We have guidelines on our uniforms that we wear. So we wear the little hat. I have a lot of pins in my hat because I have been involved with the Polar Express train ride for several years, well, over 10 years. So each year we get a little pin commemorating that we've been on the Polar Express. We wear the black pants, black vest, white shirt, blue or black tie. This is very much what the docents in the museum wear. We also have safety shoes that we wear because we're walking on rocks and ballast and gravel all day and standing, so we don't want to injure our feet. We have gloves that we wear when we're out throwing switches or we're working in any mechanical area on the train. We wear safety glasses because dust and dirt can come up from the track when we're out there working, so we want to protect our eyes. If we're in an area where there's hard hats are required, we have to wear those. So natural fibers inside the steam engine. So we try to keep it as authentic as possible.
And my uniform is pretty much authentic steam locomotive uniform. It's, as Michelle said, natural fibers. It's the long, what are they called? Overalls with a long sleeve shirt. It's all natural fibers. In this case, it's 100% cotton, just in case there's like an explosion in the cab of the steam locomotive. If you're wearing polyester and you get hit with really, really hot water, that polyester will melt to your body and cause even more damage. Where this 100% cotton or leather, but I don't know anybody that wears leather on hot days. This will protect you a little more than polyester fabrics would. So I've got my overalls on. As Michelle mentioned, I do wear gloves when I'm up in the cab of the locomotive. We've got our lovely steel-toed boots, eye protection. I have my sunglasses that I generally wear outside. And then we also have ear protection, little earplugs that we plug in because it gets pretty noisy out there.
Right. And there's another two pieces of uniform that I wear. I have to have a lot of keys. So conductor always has a lot of keys to unlock all of the equipment. So that's something we wear. And also I have a ticket punch. So this is what I would punch all the tickets with to make sure people are on the right train, and people love to have their tickets punched when they come on the train. Each conductor has a different punch so that you know if a ticket's been used before. So those are two pieces of equipment that I usually wear. Plus a flashlight. It gets pretty dark inside the engine and the cars when all of the shades are pulled down. That's something else.
Yes. I don't know how we're doing on time. Do we have time for another question? Okay. Last question.
Yeah, the last question, I want to really nail in the Women's History Month theme. So, you know, like it or not, seeing a woman in a locomotive, it does get reactions out of people. It's a surprising sight for some people. So what kind of reactions do you tend to get from people when you're operating the locomotive?
I get a lot of thumbs up, which is really kind of cool. Sometimes I just have people staring and looking like, is that really a girl up there? Because sometimes I, pull my hair back. So sometimes, people may not recognize me as a girl and they think, is that really a girl going up there? a lot of the little kids or the parents get their little kids excited. Look, there's a girl up there. So, especially when they're young girls, because not a lot of people do this, and in that group of people that do it, there's even fewer females. So, kind of in a way, I want to show that it's possible. Yeah, I was afraid of this stuff, but I realized, hey, piece of cake. As long as you're pretty smart up here, piece of cake.
I have had very few people question my credentials when I come out as conductor. I'm usually wearing uniform, says conductor on my hat. Even if I'm not wearing, if I'm wearing overalls and I have a hat on that says conductor, very few people question me. Sometimes people go, "Oh, I need to talk to the conductor," and be like, "You are." And then it flows from there. I think people are used to seeing docents in the museum, women docents in the museum and on the train. So women conductor is not very unusual here. I do get questions of, well, look, she's going to be driving the train. Be like, no, I'm not driving the train. I'm in charge of the train. The engineer is driving the train. So those are the types of questions I would get from somebody. But hardly ever anybody questioning my authority.
Good. I'm glad there's so many positive reactions. That's great to hear. All right, we're running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to go ahead and get a video started for our viewers. And I just want to remind everybody to check out that Q&A. If you have any questions at all that you'd like answered, go ahead and enter them in the Q&A and we'll go over them all together at the end.
Hi, I'm Cheryl, and I'm a volunteer engineer for the Sacramento Southern Railroad. The Sacramento Southern Railroad is the California State Railroad Museum's excursion train. And currently I'm standing in front of the 913, Western Pacific 913. It was built in 1947 for the Western Pacific Railroad. The horsepower is 1,500 horsepower. And if you can imagine 1,500 horses all tied together pulling something, it would be equivalent to this, this lovely locomotive. The 913 weighs 280 pounds, and it's an F7 type locomotive. Shall we go inside and take a look at the cab? Hi, we're up in the cab of the 913. And I'm going to show you how we would normally start it. We're not actually going to start it today because it's very, very loud. And that's why I've got my earplugs too, because you got to wear these. Anyway, this is the control stand or control panel. You'd want to have the fuel pump and the control on. Then we would go into the back and actually hit the start button. Okay, we are in the engine room of the 913. Earlier when I said it was an F unit, that meant that there's only one engine, and here is the engine, this whole big monster thing. Some locomotives, like the 6051 in the museum's collection, they have two of these back to back. So that would be an E unit. But we'd come back here, and to start the locomotive, on the control stand in the cab, we've got the control switch and the fuel pump switch on. We'd switch this over. Well, we'd make sure that this is in the right left-hand position to make sure that fuel is flowing. And I'd check my little fuel bulb on the far side. Probably not enough light to see it back there, but I want to make sure one of them, the one that's closest to the engine, is full. And then make sure that this is in start. And then I come over here and press the start button. When I want to turn it off, I press the stop button. But after I've started, this is the little switch that says start. But after I've started it, I want to turn it down to run. Because if I don't turn it down to run, the locomotive's not going to go anywhere when I pull the throttle. So to start and stop, it's on start. To run, it's on run. And sometimes I forget that and pull the throttle and nothing happens. And everybody laughs at me. Okay, now that we've turned it on, let's go back up into the cab and learn how this puppy steers. Okay, now that we've started the locomotive, pretend started the locomotive, we would come up here and let the air pump up into the system a little. This has air brakes, and they work by having air in a train line, which we'll see later on. And if the air is in the line, then the brakes will be off. If for some reason air leaks out of the train line or the brakes are applied to take air out of the train line, that's when the train will slow down and stop. So that's basically how you stop a locomotive. And these are the two brakes that we would use. Okay, this is the independent, or sometimes I call it the locomotive brake, and this is the automatic or the train brake. However, with the train brake, when you put the train brake on, that will also apply the locomotive brakes. So then you'd need to come over here, especially if you're going at any rate of speed, and bail off of the train brakes by pushing it down. So that way, all this weight that you have behind you isn't going to come crashing into a stopped or slowing locomotive at the front of the train. So we've got various positions with the brakes. The independent, is off here and on here. It's all one movement. And if you want to bail them off or release the train brakes, you just push down like that. This is the automatic, and we've got various notches here. I don't know, can you see those little notches in there? This is the normal position for when the train is running. It's called running release. If I want to slow or stop the train, I would move it over here to service application, and then move it back to lap. Doing that will hold, say, our train line has 90 pounds of air in it. If I want to slow down a little, I might take like 2 or 3 pounds out of it. And remember, when you take air out, that's what makes it stop. So taking 2 to 3 pounds off out of the train line will make it slow down. And by moving backwards against this notch here, it holds that application. If I need to take some more, I just move it over here again. Maybe it'll go down to 5 pounds and then move it back. And I can tell all by my gauges here. Those two gauges, the red needle, you can barely see it right there because everything is at 0 right now. The red needle is the brake cylinder. The white needle is the brake pipe. Over here on this other side, the red needle is the main reservoir, and the white needle is the equalizing reservoir. Now see, if I want to stop really quick, I'd throw it all the way over here into emergency. But if I have to do that, then I gotta make sure I bail off these brakes, because boy, we'll just have a little smasharoo going on, perhaps, if you're going at any rate of speed. But you know, that's okay. On the Sacramento Southern, we never go any more than 20 miles an hour. Very often less than that. So that's pretty much it for the brakes. To make it go, this is the reverser, because it reverses the movement. Forward this way. This is basically neutral, if you will, and backwards this way. So you want to go forwards, you push it forward, and then pull on the throttle here. There are 8 notches in there, and that equates to various speeds. So 1 would be the slowest, 8 would be the fastest. And again, if you're using your brakes to slow down, it's also a good thing to coordinate with your throttle, pushing your throttle in too. Otherwise, it's kind of like pushing on the gas pedal and also pushing on the brake. You're kind of defeating the purpose. The sander here, forward and backwards, so it would deposit sand, like beach sand, in the front of the wheel or the back of the wheel, depending on if you're going in a forward motion or a reverse motion. And if you guys have ever ridden a bike, like maybe on snow or ice, and you kind of slip a little and maybe you fall off the bike, that means you don't have any traction. So with a big locomotive, you need some traction to keep those wheels spinning on the rail. Otherwise, they just spin like this and you're not moving forward, almost sliding on the rail, if you will. This is the bell. And again, the engine isn't started, so you're not going to hear anything. And this is the whistle. We can communicate with our fellow crew members with the whistle. Like 2 toots of the whistle would mean I'm going forward, or I acknowledge what you just told me. 3 would mean a backwards move. 4 is a grade crossing warning, which I'm sure you've all heard. If you're stopped at a grade crossing and the gates are down and you hear a train coming by, they'll blow long, long, short, long. That's a grade crossing, and that's what the little whistle is for here. The radio, another means of communication with fellow crew members. And we've all been told, all the engineers here have all been told, a good engineer only does what they're told when they're told. So that's why we've got various methods of communication. Radio, there could be somebody down on the ground giving me signals. So you kind of have to pay a little bit of attention up here, but you can only go forwards or backwards. So it's actually pretty easy once you get the hang of the brakes and the speed and how much distance you need to stop. That's the biggest thing, is trying to stop it where you want to. That took me a lot of practice. Over here would be the fireman. Basically, on a diesel locomotive, he or she would be the second set of eyes, because if you can kind of see, the visibility is not that great for me over on that side. So there would be somebody over on the left-hand side watching for any potential hazards. And then if we had a third crew person, the brakeman, they'd get this lovely little jump seat here. So now that we know how to drive trains, let's go back to our panel and we'll talk about our experiences and answer any questions that you might have.
That was so interesting. That looks like a lot. Well, I think we're actually out of time for any other questions, but I learned so much today. This has been really fun, and just we appreciate so much for taking your time to come in, talk to us, and the students out there. Thank you so much for coming in, Cheryl, Michelle, and
You're very welcome.
get on the train.
Very welcome. Yeah.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month, when our theme will be about the environmental history of the railroad. So make sure you tune in then. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Should have brought a training whistle.
Yeah.